big, spicy hot take coming at you right now. And that is, anime is weird.
Here you go. It's an invitation to my birthday tomorrow. I hope you'll be able to make it to the party. But why?
I'll kill you.
And this is not up for debate. Now, I want to be clear, anime is not weird because culturally we don't understand it. It's not weird because it's cartoons. It's weird because it's made by weird people for weird people. And if you watch anime, you should do it with a condom on your brain or you're going to catch the weird. I know this from experience. In fact, once upon a time, I may have been what some people would call a weeb. I don't think I ever got that deep into it. I was a little too old for it. It was, a long time ago. When I was younger, anime was much harder to get access to. Dragon Ball, Ronin Warriors, Sailor Moon, stuff like that made it to like Saturday morning cartoons every once in a while. I, like many future men of culture, convinced my mom to rent me Ninja Scroll from Blockbuster a few times during middle school. By high school, like any self-respecting nerd, I joined the football team and tried to act like I'd never shouted out a special attack while jumping off the couch in my pajamas. By the time I got to college in the early 2000s, Toonami was bringing anime to a larger audience, but by then I was actually learning how to talk to girls, so I wasn't paying as much attention as I probably should have. Surprisingly, the closest I ever got to being a full-blown weeb was in my late 20s when I was a high school teacher. I ended up sponsoring anime clubs and was exposed to just how big anime had gotten since those Toonami days in the early 2000s. And suddenly, I was binging Naruto and Bleach and also diving into things like Gurren Lagann and Madoka Magica and Code Geass and Monster. Things that you won't necessarily see on Toonami, you have to look for them and you probably have to watch them on one of those sites that's likely to give your computer diseases. And from that, I was pretty much hooked. I even started reading a lot of manga for anime that weren't getting second seasons. So suddenly I had a collection of Spice and Wolf books. Still holding out for season 3, guys. It's only been like a decade. I even discovered early Anitube in the late 2000s, early 2010s. So I watched influential creators like Beatrice the Golden Witch, Giga, Kanido, Glass Reflection, and the legendary cryptid Demolition D. I was in there. Like, some of you watching this don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. But there's a collection of people, maybe my people, watching this video's first little section saying, he just like me for real. It was awesome because I've always been a lover of media and good stories. And here was this untapped world of media and good stories at my fingertips, mostly for free. Literally thousands of shows and thousands of manga that I just indulged in until Sword Art Online came out. And all of a sudden, anime stopped being the cool weird that I've always loved and started being that weird I was talking about at the very beginning of the video. I am no prude. I was born in the 80s. I'm a child of the relatively unchaperoned post-Reagan, pre-Columbine 90s television consumption era. I watched Aeon Flux as a preteen and Two Girls, One Cup as an adult. So when I talk about anime getting weird, it's not just about getting tired of some of the way that anime can definitely be in bad taste or overly lewd or trashy, but something about anime as a whole, the culture building under the medium, didn't sit right with me anymore. Not all of it, of course. I still came through to partake in the most hypest of hype shows and Google an anime titty or two when the time was right. But the zeal I had for this world of art was gone. But almost the whole time while growing distant with anime, I also became very much invested in working with young men and boys. I had been a teacher that whole time, but also consistently worked with young people outside of work, eventually moving into working with at-risk youth in the juvenile court systems, which led to working in public health. And during that whole process, I was also studying gender and health at the graduate school level, and I had 2 little boys of my own. The combination of my work and my studies and my experiences led me to really become more invested in the issues and challenges that face young men and boys. I watched a lot of young men and boys struggle through life, struggle through the juvenile court system, struggle through their teenage years, but also friends and peers struggle in adulthood, struggle with substance addiction, struggle with divorce, struggle with parenting, struggle with death. And some of these men even met unexpected and untimely deaths of their own at their own hands. And this grew in me a desire to say something, to do something, to offer in whatever way I can anything to help out the young men and boys that I had been seeing struggling throughout the course of my life. And somewhere along the line, that brought me to YouTube. And although I didn't start YouTube with that specifically in mind, it clearly has been a core feature of the type of content that I make on this channel. I've talked about the manosphere, I've talked about edgelords, I've talked about sex, I've talked about more sex. I'm probably gonna talk about sex again. But today, I'm gonna talk about anime. After a long time away from the medium, the intersection of anime and all of the men and young guys who like it has brought me to ask a question. Why do guys like anime?
Awesome. It's really simple. What draws boys and men to anime? Like, what gets guys in particular into anime? Fight scenes, action. The plot. Now, do you mean Divine the plot. I've watched enough anime to know that plot comes in different forms.
And to figure that out, I actually visited MomoCon here in Georgia, the largest anime convention in the state, possibly in the South. It doesn't take much to notice that in the West, anime and manga is one of the most significant forces in media and is loved deeply by boys and men alike. What was once a niche pocket of media when I was a kid is now so ubiquitous and well known that you see NFL stars rocking Naruto headbands in post-game interviews.
Jared Goff, Cal.
First swag Kazakage, leader of the hidden village of the demon.
And what I want to do in this video is discuss why. What is it that brings guys to anime and what do they gain from being there? Is anime all just fantasy fulfillment and animated titties, or is there something deeper for boys to glean from the medium if they make the effort? But because I spent so much time out of anime for the last decade, I figured I'd bring in 2 people that have kept the pulse on the culture to support me in this journey.
The awesome factor is a big deal, right? You know, like that's obviously a big part of it. That's what sucks kids into Naruto, into My Hero Academia. Underneath that, one of the like common themes that you'll find in basically any thing that follows the shonen formula or the shonen battle formula is this undercurrent of like training and growth and self-betterment, trying to be stronger, both, you know, physically by getting better powers, but also like most of the characters will go through some kind of emotional arc where they like really develop as a person, and that happens in tandem with the development of their powers, and that creates, you know, a metaphorical connection. And then, you know, when they beat somebody up, they're not just beating them up and it's awesome. That's a big part of it, but they're also contending with their ideals and kicking their ideals' asses.
Whatever example I could give you about literally any piece of anime, I'm sure I could find 4 or 5 animes to immediately counter that and be like, well, this one's like this. When you talk about anime specifically, it is genuinely like asking, well, what does American cinema provide for boys? I think a lot of modern shonen really takes this idea of you're a kid and you can reach these states of being an advanced self, being like becoming a Super Saiyan. I was in therapy the other fucking day and I had to explain to my therapist what a Super Saiyan was. Yeah, it's not my finest moment. That's not going in the video, is it, Fee?
No, it's not going in the video. For today's sponsor, I kind of want to start with a really quick story. For some of you who are relatively new, you may not know that I started out pretty rough on these YouTube streets. It's hard to even fully explain what small channel purgatory feels like and looks like, but it looks a little bit like this. And number one, The Rock is just special, but most of his action roles are in and of themselves a parody of what the action movie star is supposed to be. And it's hard to make it out of that position without a whole lot of luck and a few breaks from the algorithm, and if you're lucky, a cosign or some help from larger creators to give you a shot. And for me, one such larger creator was Khadijah and Bo. Aside from the fact that Khadijah and Bo shouted me out a few years ago in one of their videos, it's also the fact that I was watching a Khadijah and Bo video way back then when I saw an ad for today's sponsor, Skillshare.
Freelance and entrepreneurship, and my favorite series of classes, creative writing. I've been getting more into writing behind the scenes. I'm working on some cool stuff. So I've been really excited to take a lot of the Skillshare writing classes.
The only thing I knew how to do well as a video essayist at the time was write. I was a pretty good writer. I was a pretty good speaker. I didn't know anything else. I didn't understand lighting. I didn't even have a teleprompter, but I got free access to Skillshare for that period of time and used that to figure out a lot of fundamental things that I wasn't doing right in my videos. I want to be clear, I'm not here to sell you the idea that Skillshare can turn you into a very successful YouTuber, but it is a place for you to develop skills that you might use in video creation or entrepreneurship development or just mindfulness and organizing your life. No goal that you might set for yourself is too small for Skillshare to assist you in. Like, going back to my YouTube story, I can't stress enough the fact that I was not trying to become a big YouTuber. I was just trying to do something new, develop a new hobby, and maybe learn a few new skills. So if you want to develop these new skills, if you want to join a learning community, you can join Skillshare with a 1-month free trial by being one of the first 1,000 people to click the link in the description. I want to say thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and now back to the video. Anime, simply put, is Japanese animation, and manga is Japanese cartoon drawings. The terms anime and manga go back well over a century, but what it means now is very different than what it might have meant way in the 19th century. And that's kind of it for background in terms of like things I know I won't get yelled at about. And I'm sure, knowing anime fans, something I just said will get me yelled at. But I just want to put the disclaimer out that as we go forward in this video, this is all subjective and very much my opinion and assessment based on the information that I have. All right?
I just want to be clear. There's no maybe about this.
There's no way to land on this and stick the landing. Somebody's going to be pissed off.
Talking about anime on the internet is like it's like jumping off a building, landing on a trampoline, and halfway down you're like, wait a minute, there's no trampoline.
It actually can be quite difficult to effectively define what anime is or what anime isn't. And that previous definition barely shows the breadth of the concept of anime as a whole. For example, Nickelodeon's Avatar: The Last Airbender or The Dragon Prince or even Arcane on Netflix are clearly heavily influenced by anime, but technically don't count as such because if you just go by the definition of anime, then it must be made in Japan to count. But then you may say that if it's made in Japan, it also needs to have, the big eyes and the colorful hair and whatnot, but then something like Ping Pong the animation, which doesn't have those features but is made in Japan, wouldn't count either. So you kind of see it's really complex. What I would say is that anime is just best described as a medium of animation combined with both a cultural and visual aesthetic that, in my opinion, is pretty much unique to Japan. And this is probably most easily explained by possibly the first ever anime in a modern sense by the show Astro Boy by Osamu Tezuka in the 1950s. Tezuka is an interesting guy because he's often seen as Japanese Walt Disney and is a huge influence on the entirety of the world of animation in Japan. He's also an interesting figure because he was like a workaholic whose last words were reportedly him begging on his deathbed to be allowed to go back to work. For a short period of time, he was even in Japan's Communist Party, which definitely had to be interesting. But more importantly, he gave the world Astro Boy, which also gives us the inception of what I think makes anime very unique in terms of the medium of animation, especially as it pertains to this video. See, Astro Boy is where we get the big eyes. It's where we get the spirited young boy main character, aka the shonen protagonist. But more importantly, it's probably where we get the biggest difference between animation in Japan that's made for kids, but also not really, and animation in the West, which is definitely made for kids and barely exits out of that framework. See, See, Astro Boy isn't just beating villains of the week. He's involved in geopolitics. He's got messages about discrimination and environmentalism, and like his heart is a nuclear reactor, which I'm pretty sure might have some significance in Japan. And this is unlike in the West, where animation is seen mostly as a medium aimed at children. Conversely, anime has always been both for children and adults, or more accurately, it's never been afraid to treat children as adults. In anime, shows aimed more at children won't be afraid to reveal the truths of the world around them. Just because a boy is 5 or 10 doesn't mean that they aren't aware of how big and maybe scary the world can be. And this may seem wrong to Western sensibilities, but then consider that there's a whole generation of children my age and younger who witnessed 9/11 in middle school. And my sons, who are both in elementary school, have been doing school shooter drills because guns have more rights than children in our country. When you look at shows like G.I. Joe or Transformers, you get, cool action scenes, but they're shooting lasers and nobody ever dies. And, I was watching Transformers because I thought robots were cool. Meanwhile, at around the same time, I'm sure tons of young boys in Japan were enjoying Gundam because robots are cool, just like they are in Transformers, but also war and child soldiers and death and geopolitics and PTSD. You kind of see the difference here.
Part of the issue is a lot that comes to mind, right? It's one of the dominant topics of the whole industry, basically. Gundam's really fascinating in how it explores, the child's perspective on war to a certain extent. And there's a lot of different iterations of that.
I think what I'm getting at, I'm realizing through your words, is that anime humanizes boys differently.
Mm-hmm.
And with good anime that does well with the topic of masculinity, humanizes boys differently. Whereas like a more shallow engagement with boyhood into manhood might just be strong. Strong is awesome. Anime is more like earn strength, and then what are you using it for?
So why is it that anime is allowed to be so much more adult and complex compared to Western animation? And I don't have a really good reason for that, but I think one of the core aspects of it is that anime, to an extent, is more artistically pure or artistically driven in comparison to Western animation, which probably sounds ridiculous to those of you who know anything about capitalism in Japan, which is like the best capitalism, which is also like the worst capitalism. The anime and manga industry is saturated with exploitation of labor. So it's not like it's a better version, but just like, follow me for a second. Japan as a culture is more collectivist than the West, which means that culturally they're more likely to just go along to get along. And when you combine this with the uncaring coldness of capitalism, it produces a horrible culture of work that, while exploitative and horrifying, also leads to an attitude of leaders leaving their workers to have more autonomy compared to the type of micromanagement and focus testing oversight that we'll have in pretty much any type of work in the West. So take that and then combine that with the fact that most anime start out as stories created by a singular artist with a very specific and explicit story in their head, something that they want to get out there to hopefully get them noticed and get picked up and be made into a bigger anime or manga. And of course, all of these stories are very much capable of being highly derivative of other media that these artists consume or are informed by popular tropes. But even in the most derivative stories, there's still that fact that these artists can lead the story into whatever way they want to, pretty much from jump. So an anime may start out as a manga made by just one guy who was working on it on his own, and maybe he'll get like a small team of assistants, or in this concept called light novels, which are basically short chapter books. And there will be editors and producers that come and help a little bit, but compared to the brand managed, focus tested, significant oversight that we see in the West, it might as well be independently produced by comparison. And when these mangas or light novels or whatever become animes, there is a definite increase in the oversight and production, but relatively little will be changed from the original story that the author had in mind when he started. So this amounts to a medium dominated by unique artistic voices. And since many of these creators, specifically creators of shonen anime, which are the anime that are generally the most popular and explicitly directed at young boys, that's what shonen means. These folks start out creating a lot of this stuff when they're just young boys themselves. And then they're influenced both by their experiences, but also the medium they grew up consuming. And then the core demographic that they're producing this content for is also young men like them. And so what you have is a medium with a uniquely dynamic artistic voice when it comes to engaging with boyhood and masculinity. You get shows like My Hero Academia, which is not like a groundbreaking original show. It's a shonen superhero manga, but it refines all of the main tropes and themes from this type of show into its best elements. So yes, we get awesome action, people yelling out special attacks, and of course a bit of fan service. But we also get boys working through various forms of trauma, social commentary on the nature of justice and the role of police and authority, and dealing with toxic parents. Deku, the main character, is a perfect distillation of what a shonen protagonist can be. He's got pieces to him missing that he's trying to fill in through his adventure. He puts it all on the line for his friends. He's got a moral code that evolves over time, but he's also emotional to a fault in some people's eyes.
What makes him like kind of the ideal shonen protagonist?
He's got trauma.
My dad started off at the bottom.
Very bottom. Yep.
Very bottom, yes. Quirkless.
He is both the generic shonen protagonist, but also an elevation of all the tropes that make a shonen protagonist cool. But even older stuff like Dragon Ball gives us powerful moments for boys to aspire and relate to. And no, I'm not talking about the obnoxious main character that has the even more obnoxious fan base, but his more interesting rival, Vegeta. Vegeta starts the show as a very one-of-the-mill villain of the week character, only existing for power and status, and ends the show, well, ends because the show won't stop happening, as a tsundere family man living for his family. Tsundere is the other trope. We're going to put tropes that I don't define right here. All right, there we go.
Dragon Ball Z was a huge one for me, but it wasn't Goku who I was able to really see myself in. It was Vegeta. To me, Vegeta is a genuinely fantastic character, and I think his whole character arc, everything to do with him, it is about this societal idea of who you are meant to be, and eventually being able to let that go and realize that, look, you don't need to be the fucking biggest, strongest, baddest thing in the world, because you're actually just okay with your wife and kid, and that has never stopped resonating with me.
Calling him a tsundere is oversimplifying the fact that he was himself never taught how to develop emotional bonds with others. And then suddenly over the course of the show, he has a wife and a son whom he is deeply connected to. And the moment where he realizes this is one of the most powerful moments in all of anime.
He was meant to be the chosen one. He was meant to be the one who beat Frieza. But every time he came close to greatness, he failed, and then Goku or Goku's son succeeded. And so he's just full of fucking rage about this, He gives in and he becomes evil, and he beats Goku. He actually beats Goku. But then this monster that's feeding off his energy called Boo awakens, and he realizes basically what his malice, what his desire has kind of led to. And he sacrifices himself to take out this monster. And before he does that, he hugs his son for the first time ever. And it is such... I'll fucking cry. I'll fucking cry on camera right now. When I think of Vegeta's biggest moments, I don't think of the fight he wins. I think of the fact that he is able to be gentle with his son for this one moment. And what a cataclysmic shift that is from the little shit-eating heel who stepped out of the spaceship in the Saiyan saga.
Probably one of my top 5 experiences in all of media consumption was watching the show Fooly Cooly as a young man. This surreal mindfuck of a show had more to say about boyhood and growing up and experiencing puberty than any generic Western versions of this same story combined in just 6 30-minute episodes. There's all kinds of stories about the fear of manhood and growing up in Western literature for boys, like Black Boy or Catcher in the Rye, and movies like Stand By Me or Fresh, but animation allows so much more to happen. So yeah, you can have symbolic stuff like, Holden Caulfield's hat, or You can have a boy whose head is a portal to another dimension where monsters escape, but also a robot who can combine with the boy to help fight these monsters. But also every once in a while, the robot like pokes a finger out the boy's head, which embarrasses him because it kind of looks like a dick. Like it's clearly a metaphor for, you know, that unwanted erection, reminding you maybe of that time your sophomore year in high school where you're riding on the overcrowded bus and this really cute upperclassman decided that she was going to sit on your lap because her friend was sitting across from you on the bus, and you were like super excited but also really embarrassed because you started getting a little too excited and you're like praying to God that she doesn't notice what's happening. And this story is definitely not specific at all.
It is intentionally meant to speak just directly to your subconscious, to your id. It's not like, you know, it uses the medium of animation and a whole bunch of different very avant-garde directing choices to like sort of go over and under your heads at the same time, you know, both heads. Yeah, because like, you know, the main character is like in that very delicate fluctuation space. And I'll tell you, he's like at the cusp of puberty and he's scared of it. You're fucking 12 years old. You don't really know how the world works. There's a bunch of stuff happening to your body and, you know, with the people around you that like you're only starting to understand. And like at the end of the day, you just got to swing the bat.
One of the best things I've read in years is a silent voice. It follows multiple complex characters with varying levels of issues and traumas, often from bullying and social ostracism. But also, some of these characters have themselves committed heinous acts of bullying. This story, written by a female author, humanizes that experience in a way that I really wasn't ready for when I started watching it. Because it gets into the nature of struggling socially, but also peels back the dynamics of bullying and in-group, out-group dynamics in a way that you really never see in any media aimed at children. Like in media for boys in America, bullies are one-note caricatures of how we often see them in our personal lives, which is completely devoid of complexity or humanity, because that's how bullying often feels when you're on the victim side of the equation. But this manga and the movie that followed it forced us to look at the bully as a protagonist, and we have to engage with the completely reasonable process to which he finds himself bullying a girl with a disability, and then how he deals with that guilt and shame over time. I could go on forever, literally forever, but you get the point. There's so much great stuff out there if you're willing to press through the ugliness a little bit and adjust your sensibilities and open your mind to the idea that animation is more than just kids' cartoons and jiggle physics. So in this moment, I want to suggest that everybody, literally everyone who watches this video, that if you don't watch anime at all, you should try it out. Yes, there is some very, very problematic stuff in the medium. Yes, a lot of it is probably not going to be for you, but there's also some amazing things that you have missed out on because you haven't given the medium a chance. So as I said earlier, I attended MomoCon 2023, and this video's editor, Zatzman, attended Anime North in Canada, and we both asked around about what guys like about anime. And we got a lot of great answers, but there was one in particular that stuck out to me that I knew I was going to use for the video.
What do you think gets young men into anime?
I would say I feel like in my case, what got like young men into anime would be like looking for like a place to like belong, if that makes sense.
Right.
And also kind of like, it adds more personality than like what people think of stereotypical guy is like, you know, it's not just all like, you have to be like a man, you know, and all that other stuff. And it kind of lets you like explore a little bit.
Like what it means to be a person who is a man versus like a man first.
Anime sees boys. It sees where they are, and it sees where they want to go and travels with them along the way while offering a window into what the world might be for them. But at the same time, it's also a mirror into what they might be to the world. It makes boys feel powerful, but also dream and fantasize about said power and that image of boyhood growing into manhood. One thing all boys media tends to do is provide power fantasies for them to aspire to. And I think that power fantasy is a core ingredient to anime's appeal for young men. And I want to discuss why that's sometimes a good thing, but also sometimes very much not a good thing. In many male-led societies, even across cultural, racial, and historical lines, Boys are socialized in very similar ways. They're taught to see strength and power as some of the highest ideals that they can pursue to become real men. But they're also, as boys, constantly reminded that their weakness and inability to perform true manhood at their age is a problem that they need to persistently be in the pursuit of fixing.
Sometimes the understanding that this is not a realistic expectation, that you are super powerful, that every female you meet is going to become secretly infatuated to you, I think that can be kind of a dangerous thing to internalize, because then it creates this expectation of like, well, society isn't like this. This isn't happening to me.
Yeah.
So what's wrong with me, or what's
wrong with society?
You know, and that's where like I just don't enjoy seeing power fantasies to that level. And I think that's like a reasonable, good way to live, to focus on getting good instead of being perceived as good.
I feel like the way we socialize boys is very externally driven. Be a strong man or boy to protect X so you can get Y, because people will think you're Z. You know what I'm saying? Versus like, be a strong boy because you're passionate about strength, because you have an emotional attachment to the feeling you get when you master something and improve something. And these are scientifically like proven realities about motivation, that it's that motivation that comes from within is innately more valuable and more predictive of like happiness and success than external motivation.
And this is obviously somewhat of a paradox, and it's definitely probably not the healthiest tradition in how boys are socialized. The goal of that paradox is to instill in boys a drive to be constantly seeking power and status and strength as a means to prove themselves worthy of being regarded as men in their culture and communities. And it doesn't take much to see how this manifests in boys' behavior pretty much in any social situation. The competitiveness that you see in little boys especially is impossible to ignore. You can go into any group of boys around the world who are between the ages of like 5 and 10 and ask them who's the fastest, and watch all of them raise their hands to proclaim that each one of them is somehow, in fact, the fastest boy in the world. And then with minimal effort, you can get them all to race each other to prove who truly is the fastest. And that's the other thing. Over time, as these boys get older, not only do they have to be constantly reminded of the distance between themselves and real men, the vast majority will also start to realize the difference between themselves and other boys in their same age bracket who more easily excel at these traditionally masculine endeavors. They start to notice what place they come in whenever these races happen. And once a boy comes in last or near last enough time in these playground races, they'll stop raising their hand as much to even volunteer to race in the first place. And those boys might have to begin to grapple with their own shortcomings and inadequacy. I call this experience of processing the difference in distance that a boy might have between the ideal performance of masculinity and their own performance of masculinity, placebo marginalization. And this is literally a term that I coined in my master's thesis. So for the first time in a while, now, this isn't something I pulled out my ass, so to explain it a little more, I want to get back to my gender theory bag for a little bit. R.W. Connell and James Messerschmidt are two very iconic figures in the world of gender studies, and they wrote a paper called Hegemonic Masculinity, Rethinking the Concept. The short version of this paper is that Connell and Messerschmidt explain that there is an ideal or hegemonic form of masculinity that various societies and cultures expect all men in their society to pursue. This ideal may vary from culture to culture over time, but still represents a standard of behavior and performance from boys and men. And they also explain how deviation from this standard can lead to ostracism, punishment, maybe even violence, and that someone's masculinity in that regard might be marginalized or regarded as lesser due to factors such as race, disability, sexuality, economic status, etc. Connell and Messerschmidt identify the ideal of hegemonic masculinity as your typical image of the straight white male with all privileges that you might imagine intact. But they also argue that being the actual hegemonic ideal is pretty much impossible for any men, which is kind of the point. They're supposed to always be striving for it and never be satisfied in getting it, or the whole system kind of breaks down. I'm just a little grad school dropout, so please don't take what I'm saying here to be like the new gospel on masculinity, but I did argue in my thesis that this concept doesn't quite do enough to consider the experiences of boys and men who aren't traditionally seen as marginalized. For example, this theory might look at Will Smith and Chris Rock and see them as the same type of marginalized experience based solely on their race, but if you're thinking about it, that's just not good enough to truly analyze how both of these men experience masculinity. You can't just say that both of these men are black and not consider that Will Smith is 6'4", lighter skinned, and traditionally attractive, while Chris Rock is shorter, darker, skinnier, not traditionally attractive, and neuroatypical. If you compare Will Smith and Chris Rock through the years, you understand immediately that while both of these men definitely share experiences of blackness and maleness, their experiences performing masculinity are going to be very different based just on those features. This is not to say those other parts of their identities don't matter. They most definitely do. But what also matters is how gender is performed regardless of those other elements. Otherwise, we miss a lot of things about how men and boys experience the world. And this is why, although I greatly empathize with Will Smith's mindset before he slapped Chris Rock, I also completely agree with Chris Rock's opinion on why he was the one that got slapped and not August Alsina.
And who's he hit? Me. A nigga he know he could beat. That is some bitch ass shit.
Many boys will experience this sense of marginalization regardless, again, of their race or culture or background. And thus, the escapist power fantasy is very appealing to them. Now, in a perfect world, these boys will have a strong support system and good adult male figures to talk to about their issues and fears. And maybe if they want to watch an anime, they'll watch Fooly Cooly with all its visual metaphors and challenging messages and breathtaking animation. Or they'll just be one of the several million people to watch power scaling videos. Because that's the thing, for all my gushing about the possibilities and greatness of anime, it's probably mainly a place for boys and young men to indulge in power fantasies, often to a fault. And to be clear, a power fantasy in and of itself is not a problem, but anime's unique elements combined with the types of boys and young men drawn to it can make it not the healthiest combination. And to illustrate this, I'm gonna go back to what's probably patient zero, for me at least, in terms of noticing this unhealthy combination, and talk about the character Kirito from Sword Art Online. This character in this show probably gets more hate than it deserves at this point, but is also a perfect example of some of anime's worst habits in depicting masculinity and power. Sword Art Online is what's called an isekai, which is a genre where the main character goes to a new world, and the main character themselves is often in the normal world, this downtrodden and bullied and loser figure, and they go to the new world, and through some mechanism of chance or luck, they become this near God tier figure, and all their dreams come true, and all the women want to have sex with them. So in real life, Kirito is some super hacker, gamer, computer genius guy. Just because. He gets stuck in an online video game with hundreds or maybe even thousands of other people, where if you die in the video game, you die in real life. And so he sets himself to beating the game and freeing all the people, which he does with relative ease just because. Also, over the course of the first 2 or 3 seasons of this show, pretty much every woman that spends more than 10 minutes with Kirito, including even his cousin / sister, and this is treated with no sense of ick. That's definitely one fair warning to anybody entering into anime. They got some icks there with the incest. I'm not gonna hold y'all on that. If you struggled with the Lannisters in Game of Thrones, you really, really need to make sure you're easing into your anime consumption. Why does every woman that meets Kirito fall in love with him, even though he has absolutely no personality? Just because, nigga. That's how it works. On so many occasions, Kirito is met with the challenge that should present some interesting raised stakes or character development. And surely there are some cool moments to be had in watching him flex on people who don't know just how powerful he is. I won't say there's not entertainment to be had. I watched the whole first season for a reason, but there are ramifications for the type of messaging that this over-the-top, consequence-free power fantasy has on young boys who indulge in this type of power fantasy uncritically. You can imagine how a lot of boys would appreciate this formula, especially the types of boys drawn to anime, boys who are more likely to be overlooked and looked down upon, boys who feel that sense of marginalization I talked about, because they cannot present to the world an image of masculinity that would be appreciated and respected. It's no wonder why so much anime stars these types of boys, discovering some type of amazing power through some contrived means like a magical truck that sends them to another world. And I wouldn't take such issues with these types of stories if, one, they weren't so abundant, and two, it weren't so obvious that a lot of boys don't quite get that this type of fantasy fulfillment shouldn't be taken that seriously. As I've been talking about power fantasies this whole time, I'm sure there's some people who might get defensive and say that nobody is so down bad that they don't fully get that these power fantasy stories shouldn't be aspired to. And to them, I say you don't understand young boys, nor the anime community, nor how media influences people. For example, consider the way that sex is depicted in pornography and how many young boys are exposed to porn well before they have their first sexual encounter. And without the understanding that porn is incredibly unrealistic, a lot of them allow their tastes and understandings about sex to be shaped by this over-the-top and often unrealistic erotic show. And this is not to say that porn is automatically bad, just like trashy anime isn't automatically bad. I love trashy anime and manga, and I know who Pinky is. But the reality of porn addiction is real, and while we don't have a clear one-to-one example about the consumption of these types of fantasies in anime negatively affecting boys, I still feel like we need to at least be critical and have a discussion about the possibility of how these types of shows can present a problem here. And the problem to me is this. Power fantasy characters like Kirito or Meliodas from Seven Deadly Sins and others all have godlike levels of, keyword here, unearned power. Those characters are powerful just because power is cool. The concern here is what message that sends to young boys who are in that culturally influenced journey to seek power. And through this, they're trying to formulate understandings of themselves as men. Does this contribute to a sense of entitlement? Does this contribute to a spirit of helplessness and despair when they can't experience the type of adoration and esteem that these characters have automatically? What message does it send that these characters seem so happy because of what this power provides to them?
I've said it in one video or another, but it sells this fantasy that you never, ever have to grow or change or improve yourself in any way. You just keep being you, saying fuck the haters. Eventually you'll be the coolest gamer and all the girls will fall on your dick. And it's a fear of growth and a fear of like acknowledging your own flaws, right? And a lot of these trash anime really, pander to that hard, right? There's this one this season that I'm just in the middle of writing a roast about. It's called I Got a Cheat Skill in Another World and Became an Unparalleled in This One Too. Is at the start of the anime, two things about this guy. One, super nice guy who will, if he sees a bunch of guys outside a convenience store aggressively hitting on a lady who doesn't want to be hit on, he'll be the only one in the crowd who comes up and is like, hey, stop that. She clearly does not like that. Two, he's insanely fat and ugly, just the fattest, ugliest motherfucker there ever was. And his family, who are skinny and pretty, fucking hate him because he's so fat and ugly. He gets bullied. He has no friends because he's fat and ugly. It all comes back to him just being the fattest and ugliest. He punches a wall and that shows him the isekai portal. So he goes through and then he, gets these cheat weapons that let him kill a bunch of high-level monsters, and he levels up a whole bunch, and he goes to sleep. Next day he wakes up, he's tall, handsome, and skinny, and everybody claps. Literally everybody claps. And here's the thing. That's a recurring motif as this story goes forward.
So that sounds funny. That sounds funny. Now I want to watch it. Is it self-aware?
I don't know.
Editing Bay FD here, and I feel like this is a good moment to interject something that I realized in editing I hadn't addressed adequately in the video, which is the problem of depictions of sex and consent and women in anime. It's something I allude to, but I realized as I was watching this over and over, getting towards release, that it really needed more time than I gave it. But the video is already 90 minutes long and there's time constraints, so I just wanted to make sure I addressed it somewhat here before moving on. When I asked here just now, is it self-aware? I'm getting at like this overarching conflict in watching anime and watching things that are clearly problematic and lewd and edgy and, you know, not appropriate for all audiences. There's a very fine line between self-aware and indulgent and maybe trashy elements in anime that I enjoy and think are okay versus things that exist in anime and thus in the anime community that are regressive and harmful and further contribute to the spreading of harmful ideologies and behavior in anime consumers. Like if this anime that we're just talking about is satirizing the issue of lookism and fat phobia with this absurd dynamic of being bad when fat and good when skinny, I'd maybe give it somewhat of a pass. But if it's just saying all your problems would go away if you weren't fat and ugly, well, that's a clearly different set of issues. And that line between self-aware and self-indulgent is where things get a little complex. And that goes for the problem with sex and sexuality and representation in anime as a whole, specifically in shonen anime. Thankfully, first and foremost, a great thing about anime and manga that I don't touch on in the video is that there is a huge community for girl-focused and driven content in anime, which offers clear alternatives to women's representation in this medium versus the more lewd, trashy, and shallow depictions of women that happen in shonen content. Aside from the ubiquitous Sailor Moon and the legendary Madoka Magica, I've also enjoyed stuff like Nana, Princess Jellyfish, Chihaya Fura, etc. But those shows are unfortunately not prominent in anime fandom, and thus there needs to be a conversation on the connection between this power fantasy problem for boys who like anime and what that does to images of women in these shows. It's not just that every female character falls in love with the protagonist, it's also the rampant casual sexual assault that happens for laughs in these shows. Fan service in anime isn't just a problem for how it hurts stories and distracts from good characters, it also contributes to misogyny and how boys learn to see and understand women, and don't get me started on the 1,000-year-old lollies. Sex is presented to boys and young men in these mediums as a commodity, one they get access to, as Mother Basements just put it, by being the coolest, raddest gamer or whatever nonsense is said in some of these spaces. Or possibly worse, if not there to just be lewd and for casual assault and fan service, they serve as fodder for male character motivation, something that is insidiously woven through so much media aimed at boys and men. It's a problem that I want to at least make sure I acknowledge. This to make sure nobody mistakes where I'm coming from. Because even when done innocently, this contributes to a lot of misogyny that women in these spaces and in general experience. And it also hurts the boys themselves who consume this type of content because they never learn to just normally interact with women and girls, which in effect becomes this vicious cycle as they are often rejected from women's spaces because of their latent misogyny, which then leads them to being even more misogynistic. I don't think that lewd or trashy content doesn't have a right to exist, but as I stated earlier, there is no self-awareness of the line between reality and fantasy with so much of this type of content and its fan bases. I would love to live in a world where lewd and sexualized entertainment was respected and enjoyed responsibly, but we don't have that. What we have is a culture that will cry woke agenda whenever a female character takes up too much screen time or has too many clothes on, but the same community will Google Rule 34 images of that same character. What we have is a patriarchy. I'm leaving a couple of videos in the description that I think better engage with this conversation, so please check those out if you want more analysis on those issues, or just simply search YouTube for the problems of women in anime. This is not an underdeveloped conversation, thankfully. I'm just not maybe the person that needs to give the definitive statement on it. That's all on this for now, at least. Back to the video.
I'm sure there's some examples of Kirito like training and working hard that I'm not familiar with, but for the most part, when we meet Kirito, he's powerful and we have no clue how he got that powerful other than him being the main character. And we see on many occasions that he's so powerful that he literally breaks the logic of the game and the show. And this happens for no other reason than it's cool to happen in the story. And while this may titillate the power fantasy part of the brain, it sells short the boys watching it. It doesn't give them anything useful to chew on as they come out of the fantasy. And it really doesn't have to be this way because you can have both. Other examples of that same type of power fantasy done well can be found in Mob Psycho. Mob, the key character from Mob Psycho, is like Kirito, unimaginably powerful for no apparent reason. He's literally just born with the powers of an Esper. But the show spends most of its time deconstructing why this type of power is not so fulfilling and is actually maybe even limiting to the individual's growth. Over the course of the show, Mob is enticed over and over to use his powers to fulfill his desires, but he over and over again shows that his desires can be fulfilled through other means, specifically self-development and self-improvement. Mob is kind of coded neurodivergent, and he struggles socially, and he's shy and really very naive, which makes him all the things that a lot of the type of boys that like this content might be. But instead of giving them the power fantasy of what if all of those things that are their challenges just disappeared because they were so powerful, the author deconstructs why that actually isn't a solution to the problem.
He's neurodivergent coded, like pretty heavily coded to be like somewhere on the autism spectrum.
Right.
He doesn't really like get social situations very well. He's also got like a lot of pent up emotions, and those emotions are like directly tied to his power set because he's a psychic. Throughout the whole series, he's contending with different psychics who believe that having psychic powers makes them innately superior to other people. He strives to never use his powers on other people. He views his powers as, you know, just another trait, like being smart, being good with words, being athletic, that sort of thing. Throughout, you know, the whole series, he's like contending with different representations of like how somebody could use powers like his for evil. But then also a lot of it is spent just in high school, you know, dealing with high school problems. You know, he's got a crush on this girl he barely speaks to, which I think is really interesting because, you know, usually they put the love interest front and center and do like a will they, won't they thing. Right. But he's like too nervous to even speak to her most of the time. Like a lot of his growth through the series is just like learning to love himself enough that he can connect with other people and specifically have like a meaningful conversation with her.
Another example of something like this can be found in Dragon Ball Z. It's often lost in Goku's rather obnoxious fandom that Goku has always been a hard worker and that he works hard first and foremost for himself. The value and the power that Goku attains in the masses over the course of his show isn't explicitly for the desire to control and dominate others, which is how power is often depicted to boys. The value of power for Goku is that it provides him with a never-exhausting opportunity to better himself for the sole purpose of that bringing him joy. And it does give him the ability to protect those that he loves and cares about. And I think this is ideal because it doesn't always look like this in shonen anime. Many shonen anime characters do definitely protect others with their powers, whether earned or unearned, which is good. But what has always bothered me is that so many of these stories present the concept of strength and power as valuable in and of itself. For example, going back to Mob Psycho, Mob has a little brother named Ritsu, and Ritsu is envious of his older brother's power and wants power just like him. The complex he develops from this envy makes him harm himself, makes him harm others, and puts himself in danger on multiple occasions. Then when he gets the power, it makes him reckless and make worse decisions. After all of that, having that power doesn't fix the problem he actually has. The problem for Ritsu wasn't a lack of power, it was a lack of processing the issue he has with his brother. And the show illustrates this, which is what makes it so good. But so many shows just have the main character get powerful and then all of their problems go away. In the shonen anime, you'll see these characters grow in terms of power, and it's the attainment of power that somehow resolves whatever problem that they face that spurred them to want to get stronger in the first place.
What that comes down to is a question of what kind of expectations does this character create? I wouldn't say I'm in love with Goku as a character or anything and that I don't find him that interesting. But to me, what's cool about Goku isn't that he's strong, it's that he trains. You know,
I like that.
When I think of Goku, the first thing I think of is him doing backflips in the anti-gravity chamber on the way to Namek. And
I remember
moments like like him turning Super Saiyan, they are powerful because of the path that has brought him there. So say you want to compare that to something like Sword Art Online. they have like in-world explanations for why Kirito is powerful. The appeal of the character is he's powerful. You know, the appeal is like he's right there, and like I know I'm gonna say that, and there's going to be a million people who are like, well, actually, it's this reason, this reason, this reason. But when you're watching Kirito, are you watching him learn to become powerful, or are you watching him become powerful? Which does he spend 90% of his time doing?
So you have all these shows where the main character is mentally, socially, or spiritually ostracized. They're victims of bullying. They're victims of abuse. They're orphans. They're ostracized from their communities and villages. And they say to these characters in the story, through the story's themes, that you know what'll automatically fix this? If you just get stronger. And this is really bad. What a lot of these shows do is draw a through line between the pain and trauma that these main characters experience directly to how they attain power, if they go about attaining it through any effort at all. Somewhere along the line, it became cool for boys and men to be completely personified by the fact that they're in pain. I think it's tied to the fact that for men, certain emotions are taboo. Anger and lust are pretty much the only safe spaces for a lot of boys and men to funnel all of their emotions to. Being damaged in some way gives a man an excuse to be more than just an angry, fighting fuck monster. And so it makes sense that a lot of boys might feel like that's a safe way to explore other forms of emotionality. And a lot of boys don't. They see these power fantasies in the form of damaged bad boys. They see the way they're depicted. They see the way girls respond to them. And more importantly, they also often themselves have traumas that connect to them through the story. And they don't understand that these characters and archetypes aren't celebrations, they're warnings. Or at least I think that's what they're often supposed to be.
I also think, though, you need to weight it against the power fantasy, the whole thing, because the power fantasy is a huge part of shonen, you know?
Right.
And for the most part, I think that's fine. Sometimes, like when taken in totality, you can come across this idea that power is the overwhelming domination of your opposition. And to a point, that's true, but to a point, that's kind of tyranny. And in a way, it's like there's a gentleness missing from that.
To fully examine this, I'm going to discuss probably, to me, the biggest failure in all of media's recent history of depicting the damaged, broody hero archetype as being way too awesome for its own good and being completely misunderstood by a large chunk of the people consuming the media. This is a guy that I've hated on publicly multiple times and talked about in numerous pieces of content, but here's where I fully get into why I have a problem with this character in particular. So let's go ahead and get ready to break down everyone's favorite sexy fascist icon, Eren Yeager from Attack on Titan.
Got a drop on this flexin' nigga, he from Tennessee. Stay for sure, baby, let me know if you wanna eat. She like, Vaughn, you already know, just put your girl on please. I'm like, cool.
But in order to do that, you need to get me to stay still while you transformed into a Titan and ate me alive.
I'm going to spend a lot of time shit-talking Eren, but also at the same time explaining that he's an incredibly cool and awesome character in most of the ways that he's presented in the show, which is really the main problem that I have with them. It makes it impossible to strike the appropriate balance between critique and admiration. Eren is a horrible person that does horrible things, but he looks so cool doing it, and his story and behavior is so entertaining and awesome that it leads a lot of people to unironically cling to this character's behavior despite the fact that he is awful in so many ways. So to balance this out, I've actually gotten the help of an expert to roast Eren as I talk about him, and I want to introduce everybody to the very talented Ro Ramden.
Hey FD, so glad you're talking about the involuntary celibacy-afflicted reanimated corpse of a TikTok e-boy from 2019. If this man was born today, he'd be wearing a Hot Topic 21 Pilots tee stretched over an awful black and white striped turtleneck, making thirst traps to Savage Gasp songs at his freshman year dorm. But all things considered, I'm glad that we get to wax philosophical over this exterminationist manic panic hair model. This man is 14 years old, tweaking off one Anthony Jeselnik special and half a chapter of Nietzsche. He's got that Redditor philosophy, play stupid games, win stupid prizes, Bill. titled The First Non-White Man to Truly Embrace White Boy Winter. He's also compulsively down horrendous. It's in his DNA to be a horny failure. Sequence his genome and you'll find the zero play gene. Imagine getting family zoned by the only woman you love. Bummer. All right, back to you, FD.
Now, some might think I'm exaggerating by saying that Eren Yeager is a beloved character and that nobody could possibly unironically find Eren Yeager good or his actions justified. And boy, are you lucky to live in such a wonderful fantasy world. While I would like to think that the majority of viewers of this show feel like Eren is bad for what he does, I've also seen 100 different videos of Eren Yeager Sigma grind set mixes, which I don't know if these are meant to be taken seriously, but I'm not taking any fucking chances with these kids. For all the controversial topics I've engaged on in this channel about racism, sexism, misogyny, trans issues, nobody comes through to argue about how wrong I am like Eren Yeager fans. Please look through the comment section of every video I've done that has talked bad about Eren Yeager. Look at the messes I've started on Twitter pointing out my critiques about this show, and you will see that I am not making this shit up. I also want to be clear that up until the very last chapter of this manga, I loved this story. It was the only anime in that decade-long period where I wasn't paying attention that I made sure to check for whenever something new was happening. I don't critique and talk about things that I don't find entertaining or really love on some level, and Attack on Titan fits into that category. But it is that last chapter of the manga and possibly the last section of the anime that hasn't happened yet that made me rethink the entirety of the show and really ruined it for me despite how much pleasure I pulled from it. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and also spoiler warning for the end of Attack on Titan, at least in the manga, because God, I'm hoping that someone in the anime says, you know, maybe this will be the one time that we change what the author did for his own good. For those who don't know, Attack on Titan tells the story of the people of the island of Paradis known as the Eldians, and they live under this metaphysical scourge called the Titans, semi-sentient giants that roam their land and eat them for sport, like don't even digest them. The citizens of Paradis believe that they are the last people on Earth due to these Titans, but over the course of the story that centers around Eren, his close friends, and an ensemble cast, they find out that the world is not what it seems. In accordance with my earlier point about trauma being a core element to the shonen protagonist, when we meet Eren, he is definitely a sufferer of trauma. In fact, if you evaluate Eren's behavior as a kid, he's already kind of clearly emotionally imbalanced. He's a troubled child that's, I think, killed at least 2 people already. Now, he killed these people in self-defense, although yeah, all right. And this is understandable because he's living in a perpetual war zone. And then by the end of the first episode of the show, he witnesses his mother being eaten by one of the Titans. So he checks off all the lists for trauma that you might need. Later, he enlists in the military with the vow to kill all the Titans, which doesn't sound so bad in the moment because the first few seasons kind of teaches us that the Titans are soulless monsters without humanity and we shouldn't feel bad about them dying. We then watch Eren mostly bumble his way to success for the first third of the story, constantly being saved by contrivances that are only explained later, and on rare occasion earning a few W's through his own growth, which is nice. But then there's one of many big changes and reveals. First, the main characters who we meet as children go from fighting faceless, meaningless Titans to killing other humans, even at this point as teenagers. And then after that, we learn even bigger secrets, which changes the whole scope of the story. I won't give away too much, but certain events transpire that let us know that the world as we know it up until this point isn't what it seems. And as a result, Eren goes from your typical plucky shonen power fantasy protagonist to what on paper should obviously be presented as the villain of the story. He goes from being spirited and eager to stoic and cold and calculating and remorselessly murderous. He basically becomes Sephiroth, or the final boss of the Watchmen, or Thanos, or coming back to my Manosphere videos, Evil Batman. And if you remember that video or know anything about those other characters just mentioned, then you know what I'm getting at with Eren. Eren decides that to solve his problems, to solve all the issues that he's faced up from the beginning of the story, and to save his friends, he's going to murder the rest of the world. Unlike all of those other characters, except for Thanos, kinda, Eren is completely successful. And the response to his success, the global genocide that killed nearly 80% of the world's population, is like ambiguous. People will try to argue that it's not ambiguous at all, but like, I think those people are just full of shit. Like, it's clearly ambiguous or there wouldn't be this much of an argument. I don't want to get into that particular argument because that's not what I'm talking about him for in this video. But for the sake of argument, I'll leave some videos in the description that go further into that issue. My real problem here isn't just that I found the ending to be problematic and concerning and on a lot of levels maybe even stupid. My problem and reason for talking about Eren once again is that he made this global genocide look cool in the process, and worst off, justified, at least to a portion of his fan base.
How do I describe Eren Yeager's vibe, right? The vibe is day one Supreme Chop, V-Lone Soldier, Babe Fanny Pack, yellow off-white belt, ironic ahegao, anime hoodie, freshman year fit pick, you know? This is the type of guy to log into GTA 5 roleplay just to be a cop. You know he lied to his friends about seeing Hero Brian because his stepfather didn't give him enough attention at home.
It has been argued to me over and over that Eren is the villain at this point, and that the rest of the story becomes about stopping him from doing this evil plan. And I want to roll with this interpretation, but my issue is that a lot of young boys and men, and plenty of young ladies, are too attached to the power fantasy that Eren represents to ever fully see him as the villain, to be fully critical of them and see him really for what he is, and to see what the author maybe was trying to do with his particular character in this story. Eren commits atrocity after atrocity after atrocity. Please understand, before the global genocide, he had done a lot of other fucked up shit. And as his presence and influence contributes to more violence and spreading of horrendous ideologies, you'll still hear a lot of fans defend him. And this bothers me probably more than it should, because what I often hear when I hear these defenses is something along the lines of, Eren had no choice, or what would you do if you were in his position? Now, I want to imagine that I'm hearing this stuff from younger people who identify with Eren's feelings of helplessness in a world that hates them and relate to both his pain as well as his overly simplistic us versus them mentality, which in their mind justifies his action. But I can't emphasize enough how awful the theme and underlying message of this character arc actually is, especially since people don't get that the character was supposed to be looked at a certain way. Eren is a victim of unimaginable trauma, and thus I empathize with why he is the way he is. But what Eren went through isn't unique in anime. Characters like Sasuke from Naruto or Lelouch v Britannia from Code Geass have similarly tragic backstories, and while they also commit heinous acts in the name of seeking power and revenge, they do something really important and much more valuable to viewers and readers of these types of stories. In between getting power, or in the process of trying to get power and revenge, they also heal, process, and unpack from the traumas that sent them to those extremes in the first place. They engage directly with their pain at various times in their stories, and in various moments reconcile with their trauma, often at critical moments when it's time for them to make a right decision or a wrong decision. In the last third, or I guess maybe half of the show, Eren is presented as this aloof, cold, calculating, unflappable, remorseless killer that is singularly focused on a mission, and because he's singularly focused, he cuts off his friends, he cuts off anyone that's ever cared about him, and he does horrible things for the sole purpose to him of moving forward and being free. But the irony is that Eren was never free this entire time, and Eren clearly had the opportunity and choice to not do what he was doing, and he was too weak not to do it. Eren in reality is an incredibly weak man who just happens to get control of a significant power. He talks all the time about freedom, but continually acts as if he has no free will. And while so many shonen characters define themselves through purpose and close relationships and taking care of the people close to them, Eren is defined by his trauma and pain and sacrifices all his close relationships to indulge in that trauma and puts his friends and peers in grave danger just so he can complete this asinine plan he has.
is.
All right, I'm just riffing here. He had an iPod Classic loaded with Limp Bizkit and Linkin Park easily. He was really into bodybuilding, getting the bodybuilder physique in high school, and it made all of his classmates real uncomfortable seeing him all oiled up. Eren Yeager goes to unlisted Filthy Frank videos and comments about missing the old days. He definitely has a 0-follower Twitter burner with a Dark Knight Joker profile picture and a bio that says, "If you're reading this, I triggered you." He's the keynote speaker at the Cornball convention.
Coming back to the whole he didn't have a choice thing, first and foremost, I feel like he really did have like a lot of different choices, but I also want to consider why that's such an attractive and appealing situation for his fan base. And probably the most important thing I want to say in this video, and bringing this whole tangent about unearned power for the sake of having it as a bad thing full circle. The reason why people keep saying Eren had no choice is because that is a really, really effective and desirable excuse. It gives Eren an excuse to not have agency in his own actions and decisions and absolves him of real responsibility for the horrible things he does. And this is really ironic to me because I'm often one who gets criticized for always wanting to talk about the effects of systemic barriers on people's behavior and how things like crime and addiction and economics and job opportunities are all greatly dictated, not as much by people's individual behavior, but by the opportunity structures that people get. No sane people that will come to me and talk about personal responsibility in real life will give the most excuses to Eren Yeager in a fantasy story for killing billions of people. To clear that up, I want people to understand that although systemic racism and systemic barriers are a thing, that does not change the fact that at an individual level, each and every person has choices that will either lead them to a worse situation or lead them to a better situation. And as unfair as it might be at any given time, there are consequences for those decisions. But what we should be trying to do is give as many possible decisions for people to make instead of like 3 really shitty options, which makes people not care in the first place. And Eren Yeager had multiple non-shitty options compared to the one he picked. Eren made the decision that most reflected his experiences with trauma and then said he had no choice. And I think for his fans and defenders, this is the thing they like the most. One of the first things I realized working with kids is the lie in the phrase, "I don't care." I can't remember the first time it fully set in, but on so many occasions, I would pull aside a kid who was struggling for whatever reason. Maybe it was their own bad behavior. Maybe they were going through something. Maybe they were just having a bad day. Maybe whatever I was teaching was too challenging. Whatever the reason is, some of these kids, you pull them aside, and the first things they want you to know is that they don't care. I don't care what's happening. I don't care about this. I don't care about that. And it's always a lie. Because if they didn't care, they wouldn't bother to say that they don't care. The kids that upset me the most, that were the hardest to reach, were the ones that didn't even bother to have a conversation with me. When we go back to this embodied by pain concept with these characters, there's something truly freeing and powerful when you have a situation for a character that completely alleviates any rationality or humanity in their decision making. When you don't have a choice, all of a sudden life seems very simple. Eren has a built-in excuse to not actually care about the results of his actions. And in that regard, maybe he is truly free. There's this moment towards the end of the story where he's watching kids get murdered because of his actions, and he presents this like crying pain face that he doesn't want it to happen. He doesn't stop. He doesn't stop doing what he's doing. His pain and trauma frees him from morality and empathy. Everything that should make him not just a man, but also like a human being goes out the door because his trauma is who he is. And I want to be clear, I empathize with that. When you've went through something, some type of like world destroying trauma, the type of experience that makes you think you won't ever be the same again, that you won't ever have joy again, or just breathe again, or trust again. I don't have to imagine this. I know how that feels. It's this really appealing fantasy that maybe you just let the pain guide you. To say, I don't have a choice. I don't have agency. I am driven by forces beyond my control that also just so happen to maybe be driving me to do the thing that is easiest to do in my time of pain, which is give up or give in. If you've been through something, you know what that feels like.
But if you've been through something and you're watching this, then you also know what it feels like to get over something. And often that's the hardest part.
I think it's because so many boys and men don't learn that it's okay to process and remove pain. When they see other men being like happy, apart from that, it kind of pisses them off. There's a jealousy almost.
I would agree with you, but I think it's also when they see other men openly processing pain or openly coming to terms with pain, that pisses them off as well.
Yeah, because it's like they feel like we're breaking a rule that they're not allowed to break.
Like in terms of being a content creator, my size, I'm treated okay for the most part, but there is definitely something in my disposition, in the way I speak, in the way I look, that makes a type of man angry. And I don't know. I have some idea to what it is, but I also just have no interest in putting effort into the problem.
But man, what if there was a legitimate reason to just cut loose? And what if it looked as cool as Eren Yeager looks in the process? What if the pain you go through wasn't just the random happenstance of the universe? What if it was something truly special that was meant to empower and guide you for the rest of your life? What if your pain in particular was actually special? What if it gave you power? Extra points if it looks as cool as Eren Yeager looks throughout most of this story. Man, that would be great if not for the fact that Eren Yeager is really the epitome of weakness and a facade of bravado.
You gotta sympathize with this guy's plight, sure, but I've seen my own mother be devoured by a Titan 4 or 5 times, and I haven't killed even one person, if you don't count that pedestrian. Eren's the type of guy to try a rat tail and play in a post-metal band that attracts a largely white supremacist skinhead audience. He'd overuse the dying rose emoji and really gun for XXXTentacion's legacy post-death, while also being very racist about other rap. He looks gayer than me, and I look very gay. If you're straight and you laughed at that, you're going to jail for life. That's all I got. Sorry, nothing else.
And despite the ambiguity of other aspects of this story's morality, like one thing that pisses me off the most about Eren Yeager stands is that the author clearly shows to us in the very end who Eren Yeager truly is. In the last moments of the last chapter, they revert Eren back to being a little boy, and we see him crying and whining and confused about his behavior, taking absolutely no agency or responsibility, saying that he doesn't know why he did what he did. All that edgy, deluded, tough guy nonsense was not real. The truth is, Eren Yeager just gave up when he realized the truth of what was happening around him. And the irony is that for a section of the fan base, that last chapter was bad for a lot of different reasons. But for one portion of the fan base, they hated that they took the cool Chad Sigma Eren and turned him into the virgin, what do you all call it? The virgin cuck. Much like older trash protagonists, Eren Yeager doesn't challenge his fans, he babies them. This time emotionally. Where the only reasonable behavior is this bizarre, absurdist, nihilistic edgelord act of looking cool and having no friends and not caring about your future, but also like doing everything you need to do to secure your future. This aloof, damaged man-child yapping about being a real man or being his own man through stoicism and not caring about other people because all he cares about is the thing he wants to do, shouting over and over that the world is cold and you can only count on yourself. And then next thing you know, it'll be like the grind set thing again with primal workouts and Bitcoin. If Eren Yeager was real, he'd probably be on a panel with Andrew Tate. In fact, I think Eren Yeager is basically Sneeko. And as we see with Andrew Tate and Sneeko, our media has a really bad habit of making self-destructive, emotionally stunted, sociopathic men look cool and edgy and sexy. And in some cases in real life, these types of monsters are physically attractive. But to a T, those real life examples of self-indulgent edgelords are almost always fucking goofy dorks. Dorks that even just semi-well-adjusted people don't really want to be around. They're emotionally stunted humans who haven't tried or sadly maybe just haven't had the opportunity to get their shit together. Because even though I'm shit talking Andrew Tate and Sneeko, if you look at some videos I've done in the past, I've explained exactly how and why both of them ended up in the mind state that they're in. And I empathize with how hard it is to recover from any trauma. But I want to point out that if you are in the Eren did nothing wrong train, if you're allowing the excuse of trauma to guide and define someone's bad behavior in perpetuity because they look cool, you may think you look like this, but you probably look more like this. Ugh. But you might be asking, FD, I do empathize with Eren. I feel bad for him. He went through so much, and you don't get enough stories that depict that type of trauma into triumph. If you love boys so much, why would you tear down a character that they love so much when some of these boys have so few to connect with? And I'd see that as somewhat fair if I didn't think that there was a character in the same medium of anime who has all the parts and features that many think are cool in Eren, in a story that is much more meaningful and valuable for young men to engage with and aspire to. Often when we make these video essays, deconstructing, problems of the world, there's no easy, obvious solutions to talk about at the end of the video. But in this case, I got one. If you are an Eren Yeager fan who identifies with how Eren Yeager has allowed his pain to affect him, but also maybe wants to have more from that message, and maybe, God forbid, you're interested in stories about healing and growing, but you still want your edgy power fantasy as well, boy, do I have a character and story for you. Berserk started in 1989, and I was 7. Which means that unlike I imagine the vast majority of Berserk fans, I actually engaged with Berserk from the age range in which it was designed for and the time in which it actually lived. And I got to re-engage with the story multiple times growing up, even though up until recently, I never was much of a fan and never took the story very seriously. But I also think that's an excellent part of the story because Berserk was written over the course of almost 40 years, which means that its author, the late Kentaro Miura, was forced to tell this story at various stages of his own growth, which means the story gets to reflect his lessons and growth as an individual and go from being this edgy thing at the beginning to one of the more meaningful mangas you'll ever read toward the end. I remember seeing Berserk a few times as a teen in my local comic book store and being immediately put off by the first few chapters of wonky art and overly edgy and seemingly pointless action. It wasn't until watching Super Eyepatch Wolf's video last year after the death of Kentaro Miura talking about Berserk that I actually decided to reread the whole thing as an adult, which I did over the last couple of months. And it was halfway through reading Berserk that the concept for this video came into view. I was watching Guts, the main character of the story, go through what he went through and learn what he learned in only the first third of the story. And it's something I want the video to focus on, that concept of healing more and how in their power fantasies, boys never get to think about the fact that the greatest power often comes or is shown through an individual's ability to heal from their traumas, not to just have the power to make the trauma go away or something. Much like Eren, Guts goes through some real shit. I won't make it a contest, but I don't know if there was a tragic backstory race with Guts that Guts would be beaten by anyone. And much like Eren later in his story, at the beginning of Guts' story, he's kind of a piece of shit. In fact, if my understanding of Kentaro Miura is right, Miura basically planned at the beginning of the story to just have all the coolest, edgiest things he could think of be thrown into his manga. Guts is mean-spirited, cruel, violent, reckless, uncaring, and he gives those classic edgelord speeches of you shouldn't care about anything or anybody, you gotta do the hardest thing forever by yourself, and no one cares, and Sigma grind set, and I don't know what this song is, but this song right here seems to be the Sigma grind set song. That's playing the whole first arc of Berserk. And no shade to the late Kentaro Miura or any of the authors that make these edgelord stories, but I want to be clear. This looks cool to little ass boys only. All these stories about not caring and moving forward and never quitting and this platitudes about courage that aren't met with any type of rationality or logic or empathy or humanity. This is the type of shit that, a little boy might think manhood is all about. Like, it should be obvious that I'm not a right-wing or conservative guy, and I don't hide that, right? But I guarantee you, if you ever need to find any commonality between me and your conservative uncle, or maybe any semi-respectable voice for masculinity from the other side of the political aisle, they will tell you that this fetishized caricature of male power as unbridled id and libido, absent of responsibility or sacrifice or empathy, is not at all the type of man that any young man or boy should aspire to be. And to his infinite credit, somewhere along the line, it seems that Miura realized this himself.
When he came up with Berserk first, he wanted the thing to be that defined guts to be rage. Like, the story is called Berserk, I think it was his desire to look into that anger and to explore why someone would feel like that is what led to this just tremendous depiction of pain, but then also recovery from that pain. Like, Miura did not have Berserk planned out when he started. He was on the journey as much as we were. In very late interviews in life, he talked about how he didn't know how Berserk was going to end because he hasn't taken that journey with the characters yet.
Wow. And that's when things in the story of Berserk become amazing. Miura, who reportedly didn't have a plan for the greater story of Berserk when he started, set out to make sense of what would make such a man behave in this edgelord nihilistic way. So he created a deep, painful, yet joyful and beautiful backstory for Guts, starting from his birth under the worst possible circumstances to the cruel and abusive actions of his first father figure, and then shows Guts finding this chosen family, this friend group that for the first time in his entire hard life gives him warmth and meaning and even love. He gets so much security and life from these experiences with these amazing people that it finally gives him the strength to seek meaning for himself outside of fighting. And then right when he's finally starting to get the hang of being his own man, he has to watch all of these people die at the hands of a person he trusted. Everything that he's built up until that point is taken away from him. And as you might expect, this breaks Guts to his core. Much like Eren, at this point in Guts' story, he's lost everything and has a perfect excuse to act not as a man, but as an animal, and he does. The edgy boy we meet in the beginning is due to the drama of that person that we followed in that section of the story. So in the first arc after the Golden Age, which chronologically happens after the Black Swordsman Age, Guts returns to his makeshift home and is faced with the ramifications of his decisions to go on this revenge-fueled rampage where he acts like an edgelord. And unlike Eren, who does not have to ever face the reality of what his decisions have wrought, Guts has to look into the eyes of the friends and peers he had left that he abandoned to indulge in his pain and trauma. One man in particular, the man that gives Guts his trademark giant sword, looks in the face of this giant, inhumanly strong killing machine, looks in the face of Guts, the edgelord that can't be killed, and questions his manhood based off the principles that he failed to uphold.
Godot has like 2 one-page monologues, and I think that's one of them. And the other is him actually talking about the act of getting better at something and improving. I'm butchering it here, but I just kept trying to make the next hammer swing better than the one that came before it, and then I woke up an old man. So in terms of like Berserk, that is such a like powerful scene when Godot is talking about like, you fucked up, you went for vengeance, you went with rage, you went to destroy, rather than actually like not even protecting Casca, but just being there for her, being with the person you love. And it's so fucking sad because like the fact that they don't make it that big a deal, the fact that it's just this casual observation, I think brings it into this real realm of like, that could be your older brother, that could be your mom, that could be your dad having that conversation with you, and it's devastating. Like, it's genuinely devastating.
And the message here, at least to me, is that vengeance, violence, and being a lone wolf That's the easy part. The hard part is living up to your promises and potential and growing despite what you've went through. And from that point on, something magical happens in this story. Guts changes. While his fighting style doesn't change, his reason for fighting does. He never stops being affected by his pain and trauma, but he responds to it differently. And there's moments where he is shocked into reality that he went through something unspeakably horrifying and lost everything and everyone he ever loved. And then as he let go of that pain, he suddenly found himself something to love again. And it's powerful and far more valuable for boys to aspire to that framework of healing and understanding that you don't have to be defined by your trauma than to be the edgy fascist boy with the abs that literally destroys the world. And in between all of this, yes, all the ladies still want to bang him, and even a few of the guys. And it's still a great power fantasy watching him cut monsters in half with one swing of his giant, not at all phallic sword. And he still looks awesome. But the reader is both confronted with that awesomeness and with the reality of trauma and pain, and how power can maybe make it easier to deal with those things, but it does not fix those things in isolation. And reading it just gave me hope. And it made me realize that we just don't talk about healing enough when we're talking about boys. We keep talking about boys being lost in this loneliness epidemic. We keep talking about the rise in suicide for men over the past few decades. And those are serious issues. But I'm reminded of the conversations I had with these boys at MomoCon. These boys were not lost. These boys were not alone. And maybe some of them are assholes when they take off the cosplay. I'm sure it's possible. But we have to remember to focus on the good things surrounding young men right now. And as many views as I know my next anti-manosphere video might get, it's more important to me that my other videos that talk a little more positively about these issues get more traction. And like, if you think about it, Luffy from One Piece is 100 times more popular than Meliodas, and boys aspire more to the hard work and dedication of Goku more than the bland self-indulgence of Kirito. And in his wildest, most matricidal future dreams, Eren Yeager couldn't hope to be worthy of polishing Guts' smallest sword. And I'm not alone in that thought. Like, shit is bad, but it's not that bad. And it doesn't have to be that bad. The badness of the situation that boys are in is not the whole of the situation. And the thing I love about anime is that it gives us examples of this. It gives us examples of boys going through shit and fighting through shit and growing stronger, not always for the sake of being stronger, but for the sake of being better and following their passions and achieving their dreams and taking care of their loved ones. I wish that anime avatars on Twitter didn't signal to me danger, but I know that when I meet a young man that is into anime, that there's good things that are gonna come out of that conversation. Because the joy that young men show in that space of loving anime, or probably anything that young boys get into, that is opportunity. And what it takes from us is to be focused on that as opposed to the things that are actually bad going on around them. Believing that boys are worthy of and expected to be good and joyful and loving and loved, as opposed to being feared and corrected and policed. In a way, I've spent so much of this video talking about the bad stuff to avoid the obvious, which is there's opportunity for goodness out there. Boys like anime because anime is awesome. And it provides them with aspirational images that are also awesome. And yes, maybe some titties every once in a while. And that's all I got for this video, y'all. Please like, share, and subscribe and all of that. Please, please, please join my Patreon if you have it in you to join. Joining my Patreon allows me to keep making videos like this, keep upping my production quality, pay for editors that can do some of the cool stuff that I know that Zatzman is doing for this video.
I'm trapped, let me out.
Furthermore, please support today's sponsor, Skillshare. And yeah, that's all I got for today, y'all. Peace.